everybody, I'm Amanda.
And I'm Len.
And we know each other through this amazing program called the Author's Corner that's sponsored by the Inner Loop, which is a DC reading series. And it's just an amazing program, and we've gotten to know one another. And poor guy, I decided that I wanted him to be my first interlocutor as we talk about how to read a poem and how people approach poems in general, because poetry is just the best. So I sent Len a poem, and he's going to read it. It's called The Wild Iris. And so go ahead, Len.
All right. The Wild Iris. At the end of my suffering there was a door. Hear me out. That which you call death I remember. Overhead, noises, branches of the pine shifting. Then nothing. The weak sun flickered over the dry surface. It is terrible to survive as consciousness buried in the dark earth. Then it was over. That which you fear, being a soul and unable to speak, ending abruptly, the stiff earth bending a little, and what I took to be birds darting in low shrubs. You who do not remember passage from the other world, I tell you I could speak again. Whatever returns from oblivion returns to find a voice. From the center of my life came a great fountain, deep blue shadows on azure seawater.
Nice. So I sent Len this poem, didn't tell him anything about it. I wanted him to just tell me what it was like to read for the first time as a novelist. Let's talk through, because an important element of reading a poem is what happens when you read it the first time. And he has to reconstruct that. He doesn't really,
So let me just sort of come clean at the beginning. I'm kind of a hapless poetry reader. I was an English major in college, and so I had to read poems for that. I read The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, I read Sylvia Plath, I read John Donne. And for me, poetry was a puzzle that you had to figure out, and you would write a paper sort of giving your interpretation of what the poem meant. But it was always sort of this opaque thing that you just sort of had to try to find what was there below the surface. And so I went to an MFA program for fiction writing, and in my MFA program there were fiction writers and there were poets, and the two were just completely siloed. They're separate. So I didn't know any of the poets didn't really know any of the fiction writers. Yeah. We just did fiction, the poets just did poetry. The only time I was exposed to it was during the student readings, and some poet would read a poem and I'd think, I have no idea what that means. My mind is wandering. I'm looking at the thermostat on the wall, whatever. Yeah. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of poetry.
Do you think if someone had read this poem, you would?
It probably would resonate with me more than one of the MFA poets in the program.
Not mine.
Not yours,
just
of course.
Kidding.
There were actually some that were really good. But
I actually had COVID when I did mine, so it was not really good.
So that's just where I'm coming from as a fiction writer who does not read a lot of poetry. So that's why we thought this experiment would be really interesting.
Yeah, he was ideal because as a writer, he knows language really well, but he approaches how he gets it on the page in a very different way. And so the first thing I noticed when he read it is that he read it as though it were a story. He didn't pause really in any place. And so I wanted him to just kind of talk through the first, second, third experiences of reading the poem, how you did it, why you did it. I think you told me that really the first two lines were already what pulled you in. So.
Yes, definitely. The first two lines pulled me in. At the end of my suffering there was a door, and it really seemed like the perfect place to start the poem. And I know with stories, that's one of the common faults when people are writing stories, is that you'll look at it and you'll think, wow, this story really starts on page 2 or page 3. And in this case, it just seemed to start at the perfect moment. At the end of my suffering, there was a door. You know, everything's about to change. There's an interesting backstory of suffering, and now there's a door, and what's on the other side of the door. So all those things kind of spoke to me and really engaged my interest in the poem right away.